My husband's hospital bills took everything. I became a gardener to survive. The butler warned, "Ignore the girl in the window. She hasn't spoken since her mom abandoned her." I saw the sadness in her eyes and placed my prize flower on the windowsill. 3 weeks later, the billionaire froze in the garden. The mute girl was sitting in the dirt with me, having fun. What he did after that made me cry. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Pauline Matthews, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I would be kneeling in someone else's garden, dirt under my fingernails, working for $2,500 a month just to have a roof over my head. But that's what happens when the love of your life fights cancer for 3 years and loses. That's what happens when the medical bills pile up to $350,000, and the insurance companies find every loophole to deny coverage. Conrad had been gone for 8 months when I finally accepted that our little house on Maple Street wasn't ours anymore. The bank had been patient, I'll give them that. They'd even seemed genuinely sorry when they handed me the foreclosure papers. But sorry doesn't pay mortgages, and my teacher's pension of $1,200 a month barely covered groceries, let alone the crushing debt that followed my husband's death like a shadow. The employment agency lady, a kind woman named Mrs. Henderson, had looked at me with those pitying eyes I'd grown to despise. "At your age, dear, with your circumstances, domestic positions are really your best option. Live-in positions provide housing, which eliminates your biggest expense." She'd said it gently, but the message was clear. At 68, recently widowed and financially ruined, I wasn't exactly a hot commodity in the job market. That's how I found myself driving my aging Honda Civic up the winding driveway of the Blackwood estate on a gray October morning. The mansion loomed ahead of me, all white columns and manicured perfection, making me feel smaller with each yard I traveled. I'd spent 40 years teaching elementary school, had owned my own home, had been respected in my community. Now I was about to become the help. The head groundskeeper, a weathered man named Thomas, met me at the service entrance. He looked me up and down with the expression of someone who'd seen too many desperate people come and go. "You're the new gardener," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mrs. Henderson said you have experience." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Experience was putting it kindly. I'd had a backyard garden that Conrad and I had tended together for 37 years. We'd grown tomatoes and roses, had even won a few ribbons at the county fair. But this was different. This was survival. "Follow me," Thomas said, leading me along a stone path that probably cost more than my annual salary. The Blackwoods are particular about their privacy. The Main family lives in the house, of course. Mr. Richard Blackwood owns several technology companies, very successful. His wife, Victoria, is. Well, she's particular about things being done right. And there's the little girl, Sophie. She's 7. He paused at a fork in the path, and I noticed his expression soften slightly. "The butler, Mr. Carlyle, he'll give you the full briefing, but I'll tell you this now because it's important. You see that window up there? Second floor? The bay window with the blue cushions?" I followed his gaze to a large window where I could just make out a small figure sitting motionless, staring down at the gardens. That's Sophie's room. She sits there most days just watching. Been like that for 3 years now, ever since her mother left. Hasn't spoken a word since. Not one word. The doctors call it selective mutism, trauma-related. Mrs. Blackwood has tried everything. Therapists, specialists, even considered sending her to a residential facility. My heart clenched. I'd taught enough children to recognize the signs of deep hurt, the kind that burrows so deep it changes the very foundation of who you are. "The thing is," Thomas continued, lowering his voice, "Mr. Carlyle and I, we have an understanding with the family. We don't engage with Sophie. Mrs. Blackwood feels it's better that way. Less confusion for the child, she says. So you'll see her sometimes, but you're to keep your distance. Understood? I wanted to argue, wanted to say that isolation never healed a child's wounded heart. But I needed this job. I needed the small room in the servants' quarters, the steady meals, the chance to start over. So I nodded. Mr. Carlyle, the butler, was exactly what you'd expect from a house like this. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of formal bearing that came from years of serving wealthy families. He led me through a maze of service corridors to my room, a small but clean space under the eaves with a window overlooking the back gardens. Your duties will include maintenance of the formal gardens, the rose beds, and the greenhouse, he explained in crisp, professional tones. Mrs. Blackwood is hosting a garden party in 6 weeks for her charity foundation, so everything must be perfect. The family keeps early hours, breakfast at 7, lunch at 1, dinner at 7. You'll take your meals in the kitchen with the other staff. Sundays are your half days, though you're expected to remain on the property. As he turned to leave, he paused. And Pauline. May I call you Pauline? About the little girl. It's truly better for everyone if you maintain appropriate boundaries. The child has been through enough disruption. After he left, I sat on the narrow bed and looked around my new home. 4 walls, a small dresser, a window with a view. It wasn't much, but it was mine for as long as I could keep this job. I unpacked my few belongings, mostly practical clothes, my gardening tools, and a small wooden box that contained my most precious possessions. My wedding ring, which I still wore, a photo of Conrad and me on our honeymoon, and the small notebook where I'd kept track of our garden over the years, noting what thrived and what failed, what brought joy and what brought disappointment. At the bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was my pride and joy, seeds from the rose I'd developed in our backyard. Conrad and I had spent 5 years cross-pollinating and selecting until we'd created something unique. A deep red bloom with the hardiness to survive harsh winters and the fragrance to fill an entire yard. I'd planned to name it Conrad's Memory and enter it in competitions. Now it felt like all I had left of our life together. The next morning, I began my work in earnest. The Blackwood Gardens were magnificent, I had to admit. Acres of formal hedges, flower beds that looked like they belonged in magazines, and a greenhouse that was better equipped than most nurseries. But there was something cold about it all, something too perfect, too controlled, like a museum exhibit rather than a living space. I was pruning the rose beds near the house when I felt eyes on me. I looked up to see Sophie at her window, her small face pale against the glass. She couldn't have weighed more than 50 pounds, all sharp angles and huge dark eyes. Her hair was dark like her father's, but her expression. There was an old sadness there that no 7-year-old should carry. Our eyes met for just a moment before she pulled back from the window, disappearing into the shadows of her room. But something in that brief connection stirred something in me I thought I'd lost. The teacher in me, maybe. The part that had always been drawn to the quiet ones, the children who carried their pain like a secret. That evening, after finishing my rounds in the greenhouse, I made a decision that would change everything. I took one of the Conrad's Memory seeds from my wooden box and planted it in a small pot, using soil I'd specially prepared with compost and nutrients. It was risky. The seed was precious, irreplaceable, but something told me it was important. For 2 weeks, I tended that small pot in secret, keeping it in a corner of the greenhouse where the family rarely ventured. I watched for the first green shoots, the way Conrad and I used to do together, holding our breath and hoping, and when the tiny plant finally pushed through the soil, I felt a spark of something I'd almost forgotten: hope. The plant grew quickly, stronger than I'd expected in this environment. Within a month, it had developed into a small but sturdy bush, and by early November, it produced its first bloom. The flower was perfect. Deep red petals with just a hint of pink at the edges, a fragrance that was both sweet and complex. Conrad would have been proud. That's when I made the decision that would set everything in motion. On a crisp November morning, when the household was busy with Mrs. Blackwood's charity breakfast downstairs, I took my precious rose, the first and only bloom of Conrad's memory, and placed it carefully on Sophie's windowsill. I didn't leave a note, didn't try to get her attention. I simply set it there, in a small glass vase I'd found in the greenhouse, and walked away. But as I rounded the corner of the house, I couldn't resist looking back. Sophie was there at the window, her small hands pressed against the glass, staring down at the rose with an expression I couldn't quite read. For just a moment, our eyes met again. And this time, she didn't pull away. 3 weeks later, on a morning when the first snow was beginning to dust the perfectly manicured gardens, I was working near the back of the property when I heard something that made my heart stop. A small voice, barely above a whisper, coming from somewhere behind me. "Play with me." I turned slowly, and there she was. Sophie, standing at the edge of the formal garden in her small coat and boots, holding my rose in her hands like it was made of spun glass. She was looking directly at me, and though her voice was soft, her words were unmistakable. "Play with me," she said again, and this time there was something almost desperate in her tone. I stood frozen in the November morning light, my pruning shears forgotten in my hands, staring at this small girl who had just spoken her first words in 3 years. Sophie clutched my rose against her chest like a lifeline, her dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that took my breath away. "Play with me," she said again, and I realized she was trembling, not from cold, but from the enormous effort it had taken to break her silence. Everything in me wanted to rush to her, to gather her up and promise her that yes, of course I would play with her. But Thomas's warnings echoed in my mind, Mr. Carlyle's stern instructions about maintaining boundaries. I glanced toward the house, half expecting to see Mrs. Blackwood materializing in one of the windows, ready to dismiss me on the spot. "Sophie," I said softly, crouching down to her level, "that's a very special flower you're holding. Do you like it?" She nodded solemnly, her grip on the vase never loosening. Up close, I could see how thin she was, how her coat hung loose on her small frame. There were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights, and her hair needed a proper brushing. "My grandmother had roses," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "Before she went away." Grandmother. My heart clenched. Of course, to a child of 7, a mother might seem ancient, might be remembered as a grandmother figure, especially if she'd been the primary caretaker. I wondered what story Sophie had been told about why her mother went away. "Would you like to help me plant some more roses?" I asked, making a decision that I knew could cost me my job. "I have a special place where they would grow very well." Her face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. She nodded eagerly, and I found myself leading her toward the back corner of the property, where a small walled garden sat mostly forgotten. It had probably been a kitchen garden once, but now it was overgrown with weeds and brambles. "This will be our secret garden," I told her, pushing open the rusty gate. "Just yours and mine. Would you like that?" "Yes," she breathed, and the word carried all the longing of a child who had been holding her voice prisoner for far too long. We spent the next hour clearing a small patch of earth, Sophie working beside me with surprising determination. She was stronger than she looked, and clearly hungry for purpose, for connection. As we worked, she began to talk in halting whispers, about the roses she remembered, about a fountain that used to work, about hiding places where she and her grandmother used to play. "She had dark hair like yours," Sophie said suddenly, looking up at me with those penetrating eyes. "And she smelled like flowers, not like perfume. Mrs. Victoria always smells like perfume." Mrs. Victoria, not Mommy or even Victoria, but the formal address of someone who felt like a stranger in her own home. "Tell me about your grandmother," I said gently, continuing to weed the soil. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her small hands working methodically to remove rocks from the dirt. She used to read to me, she finally said. Real books, not the ones Mrs. Victoria picks. And she would sing when she thought no one was listening. She had a music box with a dancing lady inside. A memory, not of a grandmother, but of her mother. I was certain now. The question was, what had really happened to her? And why was Sophie calling her grandmother? Do you miss her? I asked. The little girl's hand stilled, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She promised she'd come back, she whispered. She said she would never really leave me. But Mrs. Victoria says she was lying, that she got tired of taking care of me and wanted to go have adventures instead. My hands clenched involuntarily around the weeds I was pulling. What kind of person tells a child that her mother abandoned her because she was a burden? I forced my voice to remain steady. Sometimes grown-ups have to go away even when they don't want to. It doesn't mean they stopped loving us. Sophie nodded seriously, as if this was a concept she'd been wrestling with for years. That's what I think too. Mrs. Victoria gets angry when I say that, though. She says I'm being silly and that I need to accept reality. We worked in comfortable silence after that, and I found myself studying this remarkable child who had been carrying such a heavy emotional burden alone. There was an intelligence in her eyes that reminded me of my brightest students, the ones who saw more than adults realized, who understood the world in ways that both impressed and worried me. When we finished preparing the small plot, I had Sophie help me plant 3 more seeds from my precious collection. As we worked, I taught her about soil preparation, about giving plants space to grow, about the patience required for gardening. When will they bloom? She asked, carefully covering the last seed with soil. If we take good care of them, by next summer we should see flowers, I told her. But gardens teach us patience. Good things take time. She nodded solemnly, then looked up at me with an expression far too mature for her 7 years. Mrs. Pauline, will you still be here next summer? The question hit me like a physical blow. In her short life, this child had already learned that people disappear, that promises are broken, that even mothers can vanish without explanation. How could I promise her anything when I was just the hired help, disposable and replaceable? I'll do everything I can to stay, I said finally. But Sophie, even if something happens and I have to go away, it won't be because I don't care about you. Sometimes grown-ups don't get to choose where they live or work. She studied my face intently, then nodded. Like my grandmother. Yes, I said softly. Like your grandmother. We met like this several more times over the following weeks, always in our secret garden, always when the family was occupied elsewhere. Sophie would appear like a little ghost, usually carrying the vase with my rose, which she'd somehow managed to keep alive in her room. We would work together, planting and tending, and slowly she began to open up more. She told me about the tutor Mrs. Victoria had hired, a stern woman who believed children should be seen and not heard. She told me about the therapists who asked her endless questions about why she wouldn't talk, never seeming to understand that she had nothing to say to them. She told me about lying awake at night, listening to arguments between her father and Mrs. Victoria, words she didn't understand, but tones she recognized all too well. Daddy works a lot, she said one afternoon as we watered our small seedlings. He's always in his office or traveling. Mrs. Victoria says he's very important and has important things to do. What about you? I asked. Are you important too? She looked at me with surprise, as if this was a question that had never occurred to her. I don't know, she said quietly. Mrs. Victoria says I'm difficult. She says if I would just try harder to be normal, everyone would be happier. Normal. As if there was something wrong with a 7-year-old who had lost her mother and responded by retreating into silence. As if trauma was a choice, a failing of character rather than a natural response to overwhelming loss. Sophie, I said carefully, you're not difficult. You're a little girl who has been through something very sad, and you're doing the best you can. That's all any of us can do. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mrs. Victoria wants to send me away to a special school. I heard her talking to Daddy about it. She says I need professional help, and that it's not fair to expect her to deal with a child who won't respond to normal parenting." My blood ran cold. A special school, an institution. I'd seen too many children over the years who had been sent away when they became inconvenient, labeled as problems rather than treated as human beings who needed extra care and patience. "When did you hear this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Last week. They were in Daddy's office after dinner. Mrs. Victoria was crying and saying she's tried everything, but I make her nervous and she can't bond with me the way she should. She said maybe if I was somewhere with people who specialize in troubled children, I might finally start talking to the right people." Troubled children. As if seeking connection with a kind gardener instead of a cold stepmother was evidence of mental illness. "And what did your daddy say?" Sophie's expression grew even sadder. "He said he'd think about it. He always says he'll think about it when Mrs. Victoria wants something, but he usually does what she wants in the end." That night, I lay awake in my small room, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do with the information Sophie had shared. She was clearly not getting the emotional support she needed at home, and now there was talk of sending her away. Everything in my teacher's heart rebelled against the idea of this sensitive child being shipped off to an institution simply because she was inconvenient. But what could I do? I was just the gardener, a woman who cleaned up other people's messes for $2,500 a month and a roof over her head. I had no legal standing, no authority, no resources. The next morning, as I was tending the greenhouse, I heard voices from the main house that made me stop and listen. Mrs. Victoria was speaking in sharp, urgent tones to someone on the phone. "No, Dr. Martinez, I don't think outpatient therapy is working. She's been seeing specialists for 3 years with no real progress. And now she started exhibiting new concerning behaviors. I caught her outside yesterday, talking to herself in some kind of make-believe scenario. It's becoming worse, not better." My hands went still on the watering can. Talking to herself, Mrs. Victoria had seen Sophie in our garden, had seen her talking to me, but had interpreted it as further evidence of mental illness rather than the breakthrough it actually was. "A residential program would give her the intensive support she clearly needs," Mrs. Victoria continued. "And frankly, it would give our family a chance to heal as well. This situation is putting tremendous strain on my marriage." Strain on her marriage. Not concern for Sophie's well-being, but worry about her own comfort and convenience. Yes, I understand it's expensive, but money isn't the issue. Her father can certainly afford it, and honestly, at this point, I think it's our only option. She's becoming more withdrawn and strange every day. I set down the watering can and walked quickly back toward the house, my mind racing. Sophie was in danger of being sent away, labeled as mentally ill simply because she'd found comfort in our friendship, rather than accepting Mrs. Victoria's version of maternal care. As I rounded the corner near the rose beds, I saw movement at Sophie's window. She was there, as always, but today she was pressing a piece of paper against the glass. Even from a distance, I could see it was a drawing. Stick figures in a garden, one tall figure and one small one, surrounded by flowers. She had drawn us, our secret times together. And if Mrs. Victoria found that drawing, if she understood what it meant, Sophie would be taken away faster than either of us could imagine. I had to find a way to protect this child, even if it meant risking everything I'd built here. The opportunity to uncover the truth came 3 days later, when Mrs. Victoria left for a weekend spa retreat in the mountains. She'd been particularly agitated all week, making phone calls to various doctors and educational consultants, her voice carrying that sharp edge it got when she was orchestrating something she knew others wouldn't approve of. "I need this time to recharge," she announced at breakfast, though her words were directed more at Mr. Carlyle than at her husband or stepdaughter. "The stress of Sophie's condition has been overwhelming. Dr. Martinez thinks some distance will help me gain perspective on our next steps." Richard barely looked up from his newspaper. Of course, darling. Take all the time you need. Sophie, picking at her scrambled eggs, said nothing. But I noticed how her shoulders relaxed just